My name is Albert Lee. I'm a Chinese-Canadian photographer using Fuji cameras. My XE2S is my small compact camera, my everyday carry. But then I have like a XT1, and then there's also my X Pro 2. I was born in Halifax. My grandfather arrived here from China in 1903, and then my father eventually arrived here in 1916 as a 9-year-old boy from China. I've spent most of my life, or part of my life, living here in Halifax, but I also lived and worked in New York City and in Toronto for many years, and so I've come back here for the last 20 years now. And I just retired from Canada Post after 20 years there. When I was a kid, like when I was about 14, I hung around the Nova Scotia Museum on Spring Garden Road. It was in the School of Architecture, Ralph Medchuk building there at the time, before the museum moved up to Summer Street. There are many people there that taught me how to pursue photography, and I learned how to develop my first roll of film there when I was 14 years old. And Ron Jr. didn't want to be working for the rest of his life in his old man's store. So he decided to go to the vocational school and become a photographer. So that's where I met him. And he showed me a lot of the early ins and outs of darkroom printing and street photography. I eventually got hired to work for Womble Waterfield Photography, which was the studio that had the contract to do the work for the Chronicle Herald and the Mail Star. Eventually I ended up going to Ryerson after I worked for them. But what was most interesting was I still kept my New York connections. And so for about a year and a half, I worked at a commercial photo lab in Manhattan. And it was a large company because it had 4 floors of lab space in the studio to do Avon large format tabletop photographs, another floor to do murals, which included like the Family of Man, which was a well-renowned exhibition that traveled the world and would come back and the prints would be repaired there like big murals. Color lab, black and white lab, and I met a lot of well-known international photographers working there from Life magazine and so on. And eventually I ended up freelancing for the Toronto Star, which had a bureau at Halifax with the Atlantic Bureau. So that was how I made my connection in Toronto with the Toronto Star. I worked in Toronto for about 5 years, photographing accidents, fires, disasters, and everything else in between, like sports activities. So those were the good old days. Stock photography evolved in the late 90s. That was when you could go out and do a nice picture at Peggy's Cove and get a couple $100 for it to be used like in a calendar or in a book or for a cover of a magazine. Exhibition in 1997. Growing up Chinese in Halifax, I had received a grant from Citizenship and Immigration, and ended up like interviewing families here in the city. That evolved, and then in it was 2011, I ended up with a grant from Citizenship and Immigration where I traveled the Maritimes and interviewed the families and got my material digitized at the University of British Columbia Library, which is for educational purposes and for the masses. Well, one of the more memorable trips was with Prince Charles and Lady Diana, where Atlantic Insight magazine assigned Eric Hayes and their head of photography, David Nichols, with myself to travel the Atlantic provinces with them. Well, one good example of the heyday was covering things like rural visits, and the Toronto Star sent me to China on a 3-week assignment where we traveled 10,000 kilometers. Traveling with the writer, the late Gerald Hutting. He was the Far East Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Colorful character. He was captured by the PLO. Idi Amin had arrested him and he walked away from there. The IRA had kidnapped him. He was quite a seasoned veteran, and you don't get these characters anymore. That picture was one of my early assignments for the Toronto Star Atlantic Bureau. 1976, and it was on board an Argus aircraft from Greenwood, Nova Scotia. Yeah, you might say the last one on the earliest selfies, because I know every time I've shown it to my friends, they just love it, especially my photography friends.